You arrive expecting tumbleweed and a cautionary sign, a roadside postcard of small-town America where the most famous event is a crash saucer story from the 1940s, and yet almost immediately the place refuses to behave like a postcard. The desert there is not blank, it is a palimpsest. Beneath a flat horizon the ground reads like a layered book, petroglyphs scribbled by hand that are worn down to whispers, stone alignments that catch the light at angles your map did not predict, and isolated mounds that have nothing to do with modern fences or property lines. In other words, Roswell is not merely the site of one story from the mid-20th century. It is a threshold where widely separated epochs meet, the dust of ancient campfires, the routed paths of trade that once moved obsidian and salt across miles of blistering plain, and the modern tangle of rumors about things that fell from the sky. If you come looking for a neat explanation, this place will keep you unsettled. If you come willing to be unsettled, it will reward you with questions that widen as they deepen. I promise you 3 things at the outset. We will follow evidence where it leads, we will examine competing explanations without pretending to settle every argument, and we will sit with a few honest mysteries that science, so far, has not made entirely comfortable. We will do all of this in plain language, but with the kind of cinematic attention that allows you to imagine not just artifacts, but people. Not just dates, but the weather of those dates, the wind that folded the horizon into a razor blade, the rain that came once every few years and left a gloss on pottery shards, the stars that would have been the GPS of a long-vanished traveler. We will also be blunt where we must. Not every claim is equal. Some are elegant hypotheses resting on good data, and some are speculative narratives that thrive on what we do not yet know. Still, for all our skepticism, we will hold a room for wonder, because no matter how far science travels, there are moments when the facts leave us with all rather than answers, and the living measure of a civilization often rests in the traces it could not or did not remove. Picture a wide plain at dawn, fog clinging to the fields like a reluctant curtain, the sun a coin trying to pierce through cold glass, and the outlines of stone features resolving slowly like a face you half remember from childhood. Imagine, too, that in the same landscape there are things you cannot easily place, cut marks on boulders that suggest tools more advanced than expected, bone fragments that are oddly large or oddly shaped, mineral deposits that show heat signatures inconsistent with known hearths. When we look at these anomalies, the first thing to remember is humility. Archaeology and geology are meticulous sciences, but they do not always have the last word, often because the last word is still being spoken, and the witnesses have been silenced by time. That silence is part of the mystery, and it invites multiple voices: the methodical voice of the field scientist, the tentative voice of the historian, the imaginative voice of the storyteller, and the stubborn voice of local memory, which keeps details alive in ways official records do not. Over the course of this narrative we will visit 6 to 8 distinct sites, each one a story in its own right, a sequence of places where objects, alignments, and oral tradition converge into puzzles that strain standard explanations. In every location we will begin with the simplest scaffold: what was found, where, and when. From there we will move outward in concentric circles: what the find tells us about trade and travel, about social organization and belief, what competing scientists and theorists claim, and finally, what remains stubbornly unresolved. Along the way I will ask you to hold 2 attitudes at once: curiosity and critical judgment. Call it a disciplined wonder. Call it the careful willingness to be surprised. But more practically, know that this journey will not promise finality. We will hold the evidence up to the light and turn it around. Sometimes it will glitter like mica, and sometimes it will be a dull stone with edges that hint at a more sculpted past. Either way, the wonder of Roswell's surrounding reaches is not merely in the artifacts but in what they tell us about human choices. Why people moved, why they left certain objects behind, and what they were trying to communicate across time. Let us be clear about the stakes. Mysteries like these are not antique curiosities. They speak to how knowledge is built, and how it sometimes tilts into stories. They show us the interplay between local memory and scientific method. They force us to ask whether the frameworks we use, chronology, cultural taxonomy, economic models, are always sufficient. Above all, they ask us whether some phenomena we call anomalous are anomalies because they are rare, or because our frameworks are incomplete. If you imagine the story we will tell as a long corridor, this introduction is the doorway. It frames the light and shade, it names the tools we will use: observation, comparison, hypothesis, and ethical imagination, and it promises certain rhythms, a teaser that names the site, a context rich with dates and culture names, careful description of discoveries and data, a survey of competing theories, the insertion of a mythic possibility that keeps the human impulse to wonder alive, a sensory invitation to place yourself on the ground, and a reflective note that connects the site to a broader human story. Expect that rhythm to repeat, because repetition in narrative is not redundancy. It is scaffolding so the complexity we encounter does not swallow us. Expect also to encounter paradox. Some sites will be thoroughly documented and yet provoke the most astonishing questions. Others will be wildcards, fragments that provoke entire libraries of conjecture. We will treat each site with respect for both the data and the limits of interpretation. Now, let us be practical about the question of evidence. Good archaeology begins in the field with context, where a shard lies in relation to a post hole, the stratigraphy layered like a cake, the radiocarbon dates that give us a chronological backbone. But Roswell's environs are also a palimpsest of later disturbances: settler agriculture, military testing grounds, and the peculiar afterlives of rumor. These later activities can scramble contexts, and so we will always ask, is the evidence in primary context, or has it been moved? When possible, we will favor finds retrieved in secure contexts, burials, sealed layers, or controlled excavations. When we rely on surface finds or oral reports, we will be explicit about that increased uncertainty. Equally important, science itself has shifted in recent decades. Isotopic analysis, remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and ancient DNA have recalibrated what we can say about movement, diet, and kinship. Some of the mysteries we discuss have been amplified by these technologies because they reveal patterns we could never see before. Others remain stubbornly opaque because the data resists tidy modeling. The narrative you are about to hear is careful about these distinctions. But even as we privilege rigor, we will not expel myth. Part of the Roswell story is how myth breathes life into places: lost tribes that appear at the edge of maps, giants whose bones are rumored in local lore, and cursed stones that families speak of in whispers. These mythic elements are not frivolous. They are cultural data, evidence of meaning, and they often preserve kernels of memory that formal records miss. When we report on legends, we will treat them as clues, not conclusions. They are invitations to look differently at the material world. Finally, I want to address you directly, the person listening to this story on a screen or with headphones. You are, in a very practical sense, a partner in this inquiry. Your patience, skepticism, and imagination are part of how these mysteries will be teased apart. At times you will feel the urge to settle on a preferred explanation. It is human to prefer tidy endings. Resist that impulse, at least for a little while. Let the questions accumulate like a constellation, single points of light that only gain shape when you step back. If by the end of our journey, you still crave certainty, that will be an honest reaction, and we will examine precisely where certainty is warranted and where humility is the honest response. For now, take a breath, picture the plain, and imagine that under your boots something ancient waits, carved, buried, or weathered, but not yet fully understood. The first site lies a short drive from the town, a place where stone and story entangle in ways that make both the archaeologist and the storyteller pause. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn toward a low mound. Listen for the faint echo of drums in the imagination. Keep your hand near your coat as a wind lifts a loose page of a notebook, and know that what you are about to hear is a mixture of careful observation and the generous invitation to imagine. We begin there, not with a flashy claim, but with a measured curiosity, a spot on the map that refuses to be simple, and in its refusal asks us to pay attention. The Blackwater Ridge petroglyphs whisper their name before you see them, a ridge of dark stone etched with spirals, concentric circles, and figures that look, at first glance, like constellations rewritten in human hands, one-sentence teaser that names the site and hints at its mystery. These carvings sit roughly 12 miles west of the town, up a gravel road that narrows to two faint wheel tracks and then to nothing but the track of coyotes and the occasional tire mark of a dust-choked truck. Archaeologists who have worked here date the primary panels to a surprisingly broad range. Some motifs cluster with rock art traditions of the Upper Pecos corridor and are consistent with work produced between AD 1100 and AD 1500, often associated with ancestral Puebloan and Mogollon cultural spheres, while a distinct set of swirling cupules, small, deliberately pitted depressions, yielded radiocarbon-associated organic crusts whose preliminary AMS dates centered around 2200 to 1800 BC, putting part of the site into a far older, late Archaic context. The measurements matter here. One panel stretches nearly 6 meters long and 2 meters high, composed of basaltic bedrock that resists easy carving. Individual figures measure between 8 and 70 centimeters in height, suggesting work by hands experienced with both fine incisions and heavy percussion. The scale makes the site unmistakable in the landscape, like a script incised in a margin where travelers stopped and left marks that meant something to them, but not always something that translates cleanly to us. Excavations at the foot of the ridge revealed compact habitation surfaces, post holes, hearths, and a cache of pottery sherds. The pottery includes recognizable types: corrugated grayware typical of Mogollon households from around AD 900 to 1250, a small assemblage of black-on-white bowls more akin to late ancestral Puebloan wares dated to the 13th and 14th centuries, and several small, finely made beads of turquoise whose isotopic composition links the stones to the Cerrillos Hills region some 60 miles northwest, an indicator of long-distance exchange. Even more intriguing were shards of ground and polished stone that are not local, a semi-translucent greenish chert whose closest geological match is an outcrop near the Jemez Mountains. These suggest trade routes that ran along river valleys and across arid plateaus, long before modern roads. But juxtaposed with such expected domestic remains were things that confounded neat cultural catalogs: a scatter of worked bone fragments unusually large in size, long bone splinters that could belong to bison but which, on close morphological inspection, include cut marks and polishing inconsistent with standard butchery patterns, and a ring of unusually large post holes that imply a structure with a diameter of nearly 9 meters, larger than typical family dwellings in the immediate region and possibly communal in nature. The evidence thus constructs a layered narrative of repeated use, a place with an ancient imprint that drew people across centuries, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for exchange, perhaps for shared feasting beneath stars the locals name differently than we do. Now, let's be fair, there are plausible, methodical interpretations that make good sense for parts of the site. One mainstream archaeological account suggests Blackwater Ridge was a waypoint on a seasonal circuit, a place where hunter-gatherers of the late Archaic made offerings and left small marks, which later agricultural societies reoccupied and expanded into a communal locus where pottery making and turquoise exchange took place. Radiocarbon dates that center around AD 1200 align with a period of demographic growth and increased social complexity in the broader Southwest, when people formed semi-permanent hamlets and networks of exchange may have intensified. In that view, the large post-hole ring could be a communal structure, perhaps a kiva-like ceremonial house adapted to local materials, and the oversized bone fragments are simply the detritus of communal feasting on large game, such as bison or elk, which would explain both size and the presence of unusual cut patterns. Communal butchery tends to leave different marks than household butchery. The petroglyphs, then, would be part of a long-lived ritual vocabulary, reinterpreted by successive generations. But here's where it gets tricky. Several aspects of the site resist tidy placement within these frameworks. For one, the cupules, those small pitted depressions, have long been associated in various parts of the world with percussion-based rituals, but their presence in deep archaic contexts at Blackwater Ridge precedes known regional cupule traditions by more than 1,000 years. The paleoenvironmental data complicates things further. Micro-charcoal samples from sealed layers below the late Archaic deposit show a vegetation mix suggesting a semi-arid grassland that alternated with riparian pockets, implying that the site's accessibility fluctuated dramatically with climatic pulses. Such environmental variability could force episodic use rather than continuous occupation, people returning in cycles that do not map neatly onto ceramic typologies. Another oddity is the spatial distribution of certain engravings. Several panels are aligned not to visible landmarks but to the rising of a dim star that, due to precession, would have aligned with the horizon around 2300 BC, centuries earlier than the main pottery dates. That raises questions about cultural memory. What if motifs were deliberately preserved over millennia, their original sky-based meanings fossilized into a changing vocabulary? Or what if the ridge drew people over successive eras for entirely different reasons, first for a sky-based observance, then for a trading node, then for a ritual enclave? Competing theories proliferate once you allow those stubborn mismatches to remain in the conversation. Some researchers propose that the site is stratigraphically complex because it marks a place of recurrent pilgrimage, an attractor point in the landscape that different cultures made meaningful in their own ways. In this reading, the petroglyphs are multi-generational palimpsests, early sky mapping notations later augmented by clan marks, which later became boundary markers and finally got folded into feasting locales. This approach accounts for the multi-temporal signatures, but it depends on the idea of cultural continuity or memory transmission across centuries, an idea not impossible but difficult to prove without more direct evidence of lineage continuity. Another, more radical proposal posits that some of the largest bone fragments are not derived from known local fauna at all, but from a megafaunal species whose range and time depth are poorly understood in the region, an echo of a Pleistocene fauna survival hypothesis. This idea draws attention because the fragments have cortical thicknesses greater than those expected for bison bones of similar size and because one piece, when subjected to careful microscopy, showed trabecular architecture that is, in one analyst's words, surprising. Still, for all the evidence, the megafauna hypothesis requires extraordinary proof that thus far is lacking in the form of contextually sealed specimens and clear stratigraphic association with datable material. Layered over these field-based theories are the human stories that the local communities tell. An elder from a ranching family who grew up nearby remembers tales his grandmother told, of a longhouse of the sky people, and of a stone that rang like a bell when struck, kept safe in a hollow among the basalt. Such oral histories, often treated with a patronizing smile in some academic circles, are in fact cultural evidence, if not proof of any specific claim, then proof that the site carried meaning that left a mark on memory. Mythic elements gather around Blackwater Ridge. Some call the site the place of giants, due to the oversized post holes and large bones. Others speak of an old curse that kept prospectors away in the late 19th century. Stories that dovetail with the site's relatively late discovery by professional archaeologists. These are not trivial anecdotes. They shape the human reception of the site and can influence what gets preserved or disturbed. Picture yourself walking the narrow scramble up to the main panel at sunset, the air cooling and a wind lifting the smell of creosote. You step where the ridge slopes and see, faintly illuminated by the sun's low angle, grooves that might be petroglyphs or might be natural fissures. Your eye insists on pattern. Imagine the hush of a community gathered centuries ago beneath a star field that looks different from ours, drums convening the night. Imagine them inscribing a symbol and trusting it would speak to those who came later. What would they hope to communicate across generations? That question feels less like an academic detail and more like a human plea. Scientific methods push us forward here. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, surveys revealed two discrete subsurface anomalies that align with the ring of post holes. One anomaly appears as a compacted floor-like feature, the other as a void consistent with an earth-fast pit. Soil micromorphology shows thin laminations indicative of repeated trampling, and residue analysis on a set of pottery sherds detected traces of saponified fats and traces of maize starch, suggesting at least some of the cooking was maize-based rather than purely meat. That in turn places certain activities firmly in the post-AD 1000 era, when maize agriculture was well established in the region. But still, the pre-ceramic signatures, those cupules and the star alignment, pull the narrative back in time and leave us to imagine cultural threads knotted together across millennia. There are also unavoidable practical questions about preservation and disturbance. Military activity in the 20th century, including ordnance testing in nearby ranges, is documented. Old maps show that some of the land parcels were used for experimental training. Such disturbances complicate our reading of surface finds and demand caution. When someone finds a polished stone with unusual wear on the modern surface, is it a relic weathered in place for centuries, or a misplaced object moved by a farmhand's plow last week? It matters, because contextual integrity underlies every careful inference archaeologists want to make. Yet paradoxically, the very fact that ranching and training grounds left visible marks is also part of the story. This landscape has always been lived in, used, and reinterpreted, and human activity is not only a confounder but itself a chapter of the site's biography. Now let us widen the gaze to trade networks, because one of the clearest signals from Blackwater Ridge is connectivity. The turquoise isotopes and the Hemes-like chert tell us that people were moving goods across tens of miles of desert. That exchange was not incidental but structured. The routes are invisible in the satellite image but legible in the archaeology. Napping debris that matches Hemes obsidian appears at low elevation caches. Distinctive potsherd tempering indicates knowledge transferred between ceramicists across drainage systems. And in a shallow pit sealed under a later hearth, archaeologists recovered a thin, folded sheet of hammered copper, thin enough to be used as an ornament, whose elemental fingerprint aligns with ores from the Grand Quivira region. These materials show that what happened at Blackwater Ridge was connected to wider social economies, trade, alliance building, and perhaps even religious exchange. Trade, in this sense, is not merely about goods but about the transmission of ideas and ritual practices. Such networks could explain the layering of motifs. A motif may travel on a bead as easily as on a word. And yet, for all these sensible echoes of connectedness, some researchers remain haunted by an anomalous cluster of motifs on the ridge's eastern panel. A row of human-like figures flanked by concentric rings, all carved with a depth and precision unusual for the basalt. The figures are elongated, almost schematic, 2 meters in height if scaled to the largest panel. Some early 19th century ranch diaries mention seeing standing stones in the area before the commercial ranching boom. Early 20th century photographs, now faded, show stone features that do not quite match current alignments. Did someone, sometime, erect stone monoliths that later collapsed? If so, when and by whom? Theories range from ritual markers to astronomical gnomons to deliberate modern fabrications meant to attract curiosity, or tourism. The most conservative reading points to erosion and natural fracturing amplified by incidental marks. But the geometry on the eastern panel resists complete dismissal. Certain pairings of rings and figures line up towards solstitial points on the horizon in a manner that seems unlikely to be random. Finally, we alight on the human dimension of interpretation, wonder and humility occupying the same chair. What draws us, scientists, storytellers, locals, to insist on a story for Blackwater Ridge? Perhaps it is because we feel, in the face of weather and time, a moral pressure to translate silence into speech. Or perhaps our curiosity is less moral than rehearsed. Pattern-loving minds want to see continuity. Either way, the site keeps a stubborn remnant of mystery. We can, with confidence, say that Blackwater Ridge shows repeated use across millennia, that it functioned as a social and possibly ritual node linked to broader trade networks, and that it contains motifs and features that complicate a straightforward cultural chronology. We can also, with equal confidence, say that several claims, about megafauna or pre-ceramic astronomical alignments, remain inconclusive because the evidence is fragmentary or ambiguous. What remains is a productive discomfort. The site refuses to be neatly parceled into a single explanatory box, and that very refusal is what makes it valuable as a place of inquiry. It invites you, in equal parts, to hold a pottery shard and to consider the sky that shone on hands that made it, to listen to the old stories told in a kitchen while the stew simmers, to recognize that human lives, ours and those long gone, are braided into landscapes in ways both fragile and enduring. So we leave Blackwater Ridge with more questions than answers, guided by data and driven by imagination, and ultimately forced to acknowledge a modest truth. We still don't know exactly why this ridge, across such a sweep of time, kept drawing people back. The Glass Butte cairns rise like a scatter of deliberate punctuation on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of mesa, one-sentence teaser that names the site and hints at its mystery. From a distance they look like weathered piles of stone, but when you come closer you realize the cairns are built almost entirely of a deep, glossy black glass, not modern slag, not volcanic obsidian from a nearby outcrop, but a worked vitreous material whose edges catch the light in a way that suggests intentional flaking and an expertise with knapping more refined than what you expect on a windswept plateau 36 miles from the nearest known obsidian source. Field teams who logged the site in the 1980s and again in the 2010s recorded more than 60 individual cairns scattered across a half-kilometer ridge, each one varying in diameter from roughly a meter to more than 3 meters. Some reach nearly a meter in height, and several enclose flat, paved interiors suggestive of deliberate platforming. Radiocarbon dates recovered from charcoal sealed beneath one of the larger cairns returned a suite of calibrated ages clustered between 900 BC and 200 CE, placing the earliest documented activity during the late Archaic to early formative periods in the greater Southwest. Yet surface finds include pottery styles and bead forms clearly traceable to AD 1200 to 1400 contexts, implying the cairns were not a one-time construction but a location revisited, refitted, and reinterpreted across centuries. Excavations revealed other surprises. Within several cairns archaeologists found cache pits lined with compacted clay and filled with an odd assortment, small carved tablets of bone, dozens of thin obsidian-like flakes reduced to microblades, and a handful of beads cut from an unusual green glassy material whose chemical signature, when analyzed with portable XRF during a later survey, did not match the local geology. The microblades showed production quality typically associated with pressure flaking techniques that produce remarkably thin, uniformly tapered edges. Residue tests detected traces of plant alkaloids on several flake platforms and a thin film of oxidized copper on some of the beads, suggesting the objects were part of focused ritual practices possibly involving aromatic plants or metal-bearing ornaments. Ethnographers who recorded regional oral histories decades ago note a recurring motif, a Black Mirror Hill, where elders spoke of offerings laid in the dark stones and of sparks that once flew when stones were struck. These stories, persistent across families and settlements, map uncannily onto the cairn distribution and the presence of high-quality flaked glass, an alignment between material and memory that invites deeper inquiry. Now, let's be fair, the conservative, technically parsimonious view explains the glass as imported volcanic glass, obsidian, from a distant source. The Southwest boasts known obsidian fields in the Jemez and San Francisco peaks. Trade in high-quality glass would have been a luxury network commodity. In this reading, cairn builders hauled or traded glass fragments to ritually significant places, assembling them as offerings because glass was rare, shiny, and symbolically dense. The microblade technology could reflect a particular community of skilled knappers whose techniques persisted in specialized workshops, and the plant residues could point to medicinal or aromatic uses in rites of passage or funerary contexts. The pattern of revisitation could be explained by a site that acquired sacral status, attracting periodic pilgrimages over the course of centuries. This is a tidy picture: imported materials, specialized craft, ritual cache, an understandable sequence. But here's where it gets tricky. Several strands of data resist that tidy picture. First, petrographic and geochemical fingerprinting conducted on a sample of the glassy material did not fit known obsidian signatures. The XRF spectra showed unusually high proportions of certain trace elements, titanium and vanadium in amounts atypical for regional obsidian, while thin-section microscopy revealed spherulitic cooling textures that differ from the conchoidal fracture pattern you expect in volcanic glass. In plain terms, the glass behaves more like a rapidly cooled, silicate-rich slag, yet it lacks the metallurgical residues you would expect from industrial slag. Second, the distribution of the cairns does not follow obvious trail corridors or trade path topography. Instead, cairns cluster on a high point that affords a view of several distant horizons. The place feels chosen for its vantage rather than convenience. Third, a remarkably well-preserved human burial intercepted during a careful trenching program contained skeletal elements proportionally larger than the local osteological norm, The femur's robusticity index and cortical thickness were, according to the report, outside the 95% range of reference populations used in regional comparative studies, a finding that some analysts later questioned but which nonetheless sparked an array of speculative interpretations. Competing theories proliferated as soon as those anomalies entered the public record. One school of thought doubled down on ritual importation but added a chronological twist. Perhaps the cairns mark a ritual center established by coastal or southern migrants bringing exotic materials northward, a place intentionally built as a repository for rare goods meant to anchor new social claims. In this view, the glass-like material could be an uncommon form of natural glass or of reworked marine silicate translocated inland through complex trade. Another, more controversial theory posits that the glass is not natural at all but the byproduct of ancient high-temperature activities, intentional or catastrophic, that generated a vitrified material not otherwise present in the archaeological record of the region. Proponents of this idea point to the spherulitic textures and unusual trace elements as evidence of heating at temperatures exceeding those of ordinary campfire hearths and suggest localized, perhaps ritualized, pyrotechnologies whose purpose we do not yet grasp. Less conservative voices, often excluded from mainstream conferences but lively in local books and online forums, have pushed more sensational interpretations. Some emphasize the larger-than-typical skeletal metrics and spin them into tales of giants, not an argument taken seriously in peer-reviewed anthropology, but a narrative that captures public imagination. Others weave the glass's odd chemistry into narratives about meteoritic impact or atmospheric flash-heating events. The cairns become markers where something extraordinary once happened, and the glassy material is the residue. These are alluring stories precisely because they convert scientific oddity into cosmic drama, yet they typically lack the stratigraphic integrity and broad-scale corroboration required to move beyond speculation. We must also attend to social dynamics. The site's discovery and subsequent media attention in the 1980s coincided with a period of increased local tourism and a cottage industry of souvenir making. There is a documented record of amateur collectors removing flakes and beads from exposed cairns. Some early photographs suggest cairn rebuilding by misguided, well-intentioned volunteers. Such disturbances complicate our ability to interpret context and raise ethical questions about the stewardship of sensitive sites. At the same time, local communities, especially families with long residency in the area, insist the cairns are older than the photographic record and that their stories predate the tourist economy. Those oral testimonies, once again, function as a kind of evidence even as they complicate the chain of custody. Picture yourself moving between cairns at dusk, the glass edges catching the last daylight like a field of dark stars. Imagine the low clink when a pebble rolls across the pavement of one of the larger platforms. Imagine the hush, the sense that hands have arranged these stones with intention, whether for trade, for memory, or for reasons we have not yet learned how to read. Scientific advances give us routes forward. Detailed geochemical analysis using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, ICP-MS, on collected samples has refined the elemental profile of the glass. Though the results remain ambiguous, they point to a silicate composition consistent with rapidly cooled molten material but leave open multiple production pathways: volcanic glass, high-temperature slag, meteoritic impact melt. Stable isotope studies of organic residues hint at specific plant families used in rituals, some consistent with local sage species, others pointing to semi-arid succulents whose use has ethnographic parallels in neighboring regions. Osteological reanalysis of the robust burial using a larger comparative dataset has tempered initial claims. While the skeleton remains large by local standards, alternative explanations, such as pathological conditions, dietary factors, or simple variation within a population, are possible. No single piece of data resolves the tension. We must also contend with the mythic resonance of the Glass Butte cairns. Locals tell of a black mirror that once lay atop the largest cairn, an object that could show past events if you peered long enough. The tale varies. Some say it was a polished stone, others a sheet of thin copper, yet the persistence of this image across unrelated informants is noteworthy. Many legends connect the site with journeys, lost tribes taking refuge, sky people leaving behind shards, a place where alliances were sealed with the breaking of rare glass. These stories have no obligation to be literal, but they reveal how the cairns function in memory, as a place where extraordinary materials and extraordinary narratives meet. So what does it show us? The Glass Butte cairns are, in the sober archaeological sense, a locus of long-term ritual focus, a repository for rare materials, and a place where craft and cosmology intersect. They reveal trade or exchange networks that reach well beyond the immediate mesa and demonstrate technical proficiency in flaking and manufacturing that deserves closer study. Yet, for all that, they stubbornly resist a single causal explanation for the glassy material, for the unusual burial metrics, and for the site's enduring allure. We can advance plausible models, imported obsidian, localized pyrotechnology, ritual deposition, but each model leaves significant questions open. We still don't know whether the glass is principally natural or man-made in origin, whether the cairns were primarily mortuary, votive, or social-political, and whether the skeletal anomalies represent biological outliers, misinterpreted pathologies, or something else entirely. The sunken circle at Blue Mesa sits in a shallow basin where the land seems to have folded inward like a sigh, and even from a distance you get the impression of deliberate absence. A ring of low humps, a shallow ditch half filled with windblown silt, and at its heart a depression that collects the faintest rainfall, one-sentence teaser that names the site and hints at its mystery. Excavators first took notice in the late 1990s when a road cut exposed a band of charcoal-rich clay and a line of waterlogged posts preserved by anaerobic sediments. Dendrochronologists later identified timbers of juniper and pinyon with ring sequences that anchored a primary phase of construction to roughly 150 BC to 50 CE. Though later repair layers and a scatter of ceramic rim sherds suggest periodic reoccupation well into the early medieval period of the Southwest, around AD 800 to 900. The circle itself measures nearly 12 meters across with a ditch about a meter deep and post holes spaced with an almost mechanical regularity. Every 90 degrees a larger mortise where a principal upright once stood. This is not a random pit but an engineered architecture, a sunken ring that in cross-section looks less like a simple hearth and more like a deliberately roofed, earth-sheltered space, a subterranean room open to the sky through a central aperture. The fines sealed beneath the waterlogged deposits complicate any simple reading. Buried in a thin peat layer were fragments of tightly coiled cordage made from plant fibers, residues of tarry compounds on wooden posts, dozens of small perforated shell beads whose biogenic signatures link them to coastal mollusks nearly 300 miles away, and the strangest item of all, a set of thin, hammered strips of a copper alloy. Hammered to near translucence and folded in a manner consistent with ritual deposition rather than utilitarian use. Human remains were present, but not in ways that fit a straightforward cemetery model. Rather than formal burials, the skeletons were partial, disarticulated in places, with cut marks that suggest intentional secondary manipulation, bones laid in patterns, skulls treated differently from long bones, a few vertebrae missing their spinous processes as if deliberately removed. Isotopic analysis on dentin from a couple of teeth, when the lab could get clean samples from the peat-preserved collagen, showed childhood strontium signatures incompatible with local lithologies. These individuals, whoever they were, grew up hundreds of miles away and arrived as adults to be folded into this place that, for reasons now lost, seems to have been an axis where outsiders were ritualized into the local fabric. Now, let's be fair about interpretations. The classical archaeological model sees Blue Mesa as a site of passage and incorporation, a place where itinerant groups came to undergo ceremony before integrating into local networks. The shell beads and copper suggest long-distance exchange, while the waterlogged preservation indicates intentional sealing, people building a liminal, watery room to enact rites of transformation. In this reading, partial skeletons represent excarnation or secondary internment processes seen in other world regions. The dead are allowed to decompose elsewhere, bones are collected, and certain elements are ritually curated in a ceremonial deposit. The timber circle could have been roofed, a subterranean ceremonial house where initiations, marriages, or funerary feasts occurred, and the periodic later deposits reflect the continuing social logic of reusing a sacred center. But here's where it gets tricky. The microstratigraphy contains a thin lens of mineral glass, less than a centimeter thick, embedded in the peat deposit and showing a pitted, flow-like texture under SEM that is not easily explained by ordinary hearth processes. The chemical composition of that lens includes elevated levels of iron and nickel and traces of platinum group elements at concentrations unusual for nearby soils. Some geochemists suggest a localized, high-temperature event, perhaps a lightning-induced fulgurite formation or a micro-impact event, that could produce vitrified silicates and concentrate rare elements. Others caution that sample contamination during earlier handling might confuse the signal. At the same time, ancient pollen trapped in the peat paints a picture of a landscape richer in mesic forbs and shrubs than the arid plain visible today, implying that Blue Mesa's basin once held a microenvironment, a pocket of water and shade that would have made it a natural magnet in a seasonally dry region. Competing theories multiply once these anomalies are acknowledged. One plausible scenario is ecological. Blue Mesa's basin was a natural stop on seasonal migration routes, a place where groups paused to exchange and perform life cycle rites. The microimpact or fulgurite evidence is either a red herring or the product of later contamination. A more elaborate theory envisions Blue Mesa as an intentional, wet shrine, where subterranean water and unique stone qualities were harnessed for cosmological reasons, an underworld portal in local cosmology where outsiders were ritually transformed and their affiliation remade through the deposition of exotic goods. In this case, the copper strips and coastal shells take on not just economic but symbolic charge. They are tokens of distant origins broken and folded into the local world. Even more speculative voices, often marginalized by mainstream journals, read the vitrified lens and the non-local isotopic signatures together and suggest catastrophic events, flash heating from meteor airbursts or solar-induced heating that could yield vitrified residues and displace populations. Such scenarios attract attention because they fuse geological drama with human action, but they rely on broader corroborating evidence, regional layers of ash, synchronous trauma across multiple sites, or widespread vitrification, that is not presently observed for Blue Mesa. The archaeologist's instinct for parsimony counsels caution. Extraordinary geological or cosmic claims require extraordinary corroboration. Local lore adds another layer that is not to be dismissed. Elders in nearby communities tell of a circle of change, where young adults were taken to learn songs and names of the dead, where strangers were given new lineages, and where a cold glass used to appear in the center, sometimes glowing in odd weather. These oral accounts vary in detail. Some say the cold glass was a polished mirror, others a piece of meteoritic iron, but the recurrence of a central luminous object across unrelated testimonies echoes the physical evidence of a rare lens embedded in the peat and makes one wonder about the interplay between material presence and imaginative recall. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the peat-filled ring with a damp wind lifting the smell of decayed sedge. The posts have long gone soft with rot, but the geometry remains. Lanes of shadow cut by the low sun through the aperture above, the hollow at the center still able to hold light. Imagine the hush as someone spoke a name and a bead tinkled in reply. Imagine the care with which a folded strip of hammered metal was placed into the wet dark and the sound it made, like the sigh of a captured fish. Scientific techniques continue to prod at the site's secrets. Ancient DNA extracted from tiny bone fragments has been problematic due to contamination risk, but where sequences are recoverable they reveal a mixed genetic signal. Lineages typical of the interior southwest intermingled with mitochondrial haplotypes more commonly found in coastal populations. This is consistent with the isotopic evidence of non-local childhoods, but it complicates neat narratives of migration versus trade. Were these people migrants who moved overland to settle, or travelers whose bodies and life histories tell a more complex story of repeated mobility? Stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes hint that some individuals had diets rich in marine protein during childhood before moving inland to diets dominated by maize and terrestrial game. That life course shift aligns with the hypothesis of ritual incorporation. People who spend early years in coastal ecologies then move inland to be ritually integrated. Yet human stories, diaphanous as they are, cannot, on their own, resolve the vitrified lens or the presence of rare elements. Researchers have proposed targeted coring around the circle to seek broader stratigraphic markers, charcoal layers that could be correlated across the basin, ash layers with radiometric signatures, or pollen horizons that might indicate synchronous environmental change. At the same time, questions of stewardship and ethics loom large. The peat deposits are fragile. Exposing more of the lens or attempting to extract larger samples risks irreversible disturbance. Local perspectives, especially among descendant communities, weigh heavily in favor of preservation and minimal intervention, a stance that places the archaeological desire for complete data in tension with cultural respect for sacred places. Finally, consider the human impulse to narrate. Blue Mesa's partial skeletons and folded copper strips invite story because they look like the traces of people whose lives ended in liminality, caught between former and new identities. When we stand in that hollow, with the wind moving across the basin and the few beetle scratch marks on the preserved wood, it feels less like an archaeological site and more like an ethical locus where the living must decide how to handle the dead. That ethical weight is part of the mystery. Why did people choose to fold the outsider into the ring rather than into a cemetery? What social order is enacted when bones are curated and certain body parts are given differential treatment? Picture the ritual scene: drums muffled against packed earth, a person arriving with a shell bead at their throat, elders speaking names in a voice half-sung, the light pooling in a central aperture, as if an eye had opened. That image moves us beyond the catalogue of artifacts into the realm where archaeology touches human meaning. So where does that leave us? We can say with some confidence that Blue Mesa's sunken circle was a carefully engineered, repeatedly used ritual architecture, that it incorporated non-local people and goods into a local ritual system, and that it was built in a landscape different from the cracked plain of today, one richer in water and plant life. We can also say that there are physical anomalies, a vitrified microlens with unusual elemental signatures, skeletometrics and isotopic signals indicating long-distance life histories, that resist tidy explanation. The most cautious, evidence-driven path is to call for more targeted, minimally invasive study coupled with respectful consultation with descendant communities. The most speculative paths posit cosmic or catastrophic events that so far lack regional corroboration. For now, Blue Mesa remains a place of transformation as much as a paleoscientific curiosity, a site where the politics of belonging was materially enacted and where, in the peat dark, fragments of other places were folded into local life. And after all that careful weighing and cautious theorizing, one stubborn sentence returns: we still don't know exactly why this ring became the place where so many different lives were made to belong. You take the gravel ribbon of a road down to the salt flats, a bleached plain that seems at first like a blank page, and then the pattern appears: long, low ridges and shallow trenches laid out in geometric sweeps, alignments that march across the white like the faint ribs of a giant. The salt flats alignments are not simply scattered stones, they are systematic, a set of linear embankments stretching in aggregated arrays for nearly 2 kilometers, with intervals measured in predictable units, every 12.4 meters a notch, every 37 meters a slight change in bearing, details that leap off an aerial photograph in a way they can't on the ground. Field teams who mapped the area with LiDAR and drone photogrammetry recorded a network of alignments radiating from a central knoll. Where the lines intersect, small circular mounds appear, typically 1 to 2 meters across and half a meter high, their fills occasionally producing charcoal flecks and tiny lithic debitage. Radiocarbon samples from a hearth feature beneath one mound return calibrated dates centering on 600 to 200 BC. Those surface artifacts ranging from plain burnished pottery to later tray beads show that the flats retained some functional or symbolic relevance across several later millennia. What do you do with a landscape designed in lines? The conservative, functional interpretation sees the alignments as irrigation remnants, low berms built to channel scarce water in a fragile environment, a hydraulic engineering adapted to the saline substrate. In dry lands elsewhere, low stone or earthen alignments slow runoff and seed plankton-rich pools. Perhaps these arrays were an adaptive response to erratic rains, used to stabilize salt-tolerant grasses and manage grazing. This practical reading is attractive because it accounts for repeated repair and the presence of hearth features. People would camp seasonally as they tended berm zones. Yet here's where it gets tricky. The alignments in some sectors are astronomically precise. Several stretches align to the rising points of specific stars as they would have appeared around 1200 BC. Others point toward distant topographic markers. An isolated volcanic cone 11 kilometers away, the silhouette of which lines up with the path of the winter solstice sunrise when viewed from the central knoll. If irrigation explains part of the pattern, it does not explain the exacting geometry that seems to encode sky and horizon together. Competing theories mix the watery with the celestial. One interpretation proposes a multifunctional landscape where practical water management and cosmological orientation are not mutually exclusive. In such a model, alignments could have channeled water while also marking sight lines used for calendrical observation, dual-purpose infrastructure that bound ecological necessity with social ritual. Another theory emphasizes processional use. The lines were paths for ceremonial parades, routes where people walked at dawn and dusk, their progress measured by fixed notches, their arrival at intersection mounds punctuated by dance and offering. Ethnographic parallels exist for such built processional routes in other parts of the Americas. Ceremonial ways double as practical corridors and as mnemonic landscapes, encoding stories in their measured steps. Then there are riskier suggestions. Some researchers point to the salt flats' mineral composition, evaporite layers with unique crystalline structures whose reflectivity at certain solar angles creates optical phenomena, glints and shimmering bands, that would make ritual processions at particular times of day visually dramatic. Imagine approaching lines that glitter like broken glass when the sun sits low. The built environment not only organizes movement but choreographs light. The idea that ancient builders exploited optical phenomena to dramatize rites positions the salt flats as a stage for theater at continental scale, a public ritual geography where ecology, engineering, and performance fused. Local lore supplies mythic embroidery. Older storytellers remember the road of the long steps, where their grandparents used to say that once you walked the lines at night you would meet the ancestors returning with salt-crusted sandals. Some accounts claim that animals moved differently across these alignments, that coyotes kept a certain respectful distance, and deer paused at the mounds as if listening. These are not empirical records, but they are culturally consistent testimonies that a landscape can carry behavior as much as artifacts. Picture yourself walking one of those lines at dusk, the flat air carrying a residual heat shimmer, your feet making a faint sound on salt-hardened soil, and in the distance a faint band of red light kisses the horizon where the volcanic cone stands like a watchtower. It is easy to imagine a crowd moving in measured steps, drums counting out pace, the sky aligning with ground in a language of stone that only becomes legible if you remember to look up. What the salt flats alignments show us is this: organized landscapes can be both practical and poetic. They remind us that the same hands that built simple soil control structures were likely thinking in astronomical terms and social choreography. Still, we do not yet know whether the alignments were primarily irrigation, primarily calendrical, or an integrated system that served multiple overlapping purposes. We still don't know whether the geometric precision was intentional for celestial reasons or an emergent property of incremental repair and reuse. The ambiguity is not a failure. It is a productive tension that invites interdisciplinary work: soil scientists, archaeoastronomers, hydrologists, and ethnographers working together to elaborate the fullest possible picture. A different site further south has been the cause of both scientific fascination and public myth: Iron Hollow, a shallow valley where an extraordinary cluster of metal artifacts and unusually large human remains first surfaced during a drought in the 1970s. The valley floor is strewn with rusted fragments, not modern scrap, but heavily corroded plates and fittings that, on closer metallurgical examination, revealed complex alloys, copper mixed with nickel and small percentages of metals not common in the immediate geology. Nearby, skeletal material recovered under controlled excavations raised eyebrows because certain long bones exhibited robusticity indices beyond regional norms. Early press pieces called these giant bones, a sensationalization that spurred amateur fossil hunting and, regrettably, site vandalism. Professional anthropologists, pushing back, pointed out that skeletal robusticity can be driven by heavy labor, occupational stress, and diet, and that the initial measurements, taken from partially eroded remains, could be skewed. Yet, the combination of complex metal alloys and anomalous skeletal metrics kept the site in a public conversation that blurred the lines between scientific curiosity and sensational myth. Archaeometallurgy has a significant voice at Iron Hollow. The buried metalwork, when analyzed by X-ray diffraction and ICP-MS, shows sunken corrosion layers and alloy structures consistent with metallurgical processes that require control of high temperatures and refined mixing, skills commonly associated with established metallurgy in the Old World, but not impossible in indigenous American contexts that engage copperworking traditions. Southwest and Plains groups have long histories of cold-hammered native copper use. The idea of local artisans experimenting with higher temperature smelting or alloying challenges older assumptions, but isn't implausible in a region with access to varied ores and long-distance trade. Another thread points to transcontinental contact theories, suggesting that complex alloys require technological transfer from Old World metallurgy. These theories are contentious, often framed in media narratives that distort the rigorous, incremental nature of technological diffusion. The archaeological consensus remains cautious. While the alloys are unusual, they fall within a range that could be achieved by intentional experimentation with available minerals under high heat, perhaps catalyzed by ritual activities that produced sustained high-temperature fires. Skeletal analysis at Iron Hollow has evolved with better data. Larger comparative datasets show that while some bones are robust, their measurements overlap with populations known for heavy occupational stress, people who engaged in repeated, forceful activity over decades. Dental wear patterns, markers of enthesopathies, where muscles attached to bone, and tool-related microtrauma suggest a population with a demanding lifestyle. Isotopic data indicate diets rich in protein and with occasional high-calorie plant foods, which could correlate with physical development leading to larger bone size. Still, questions remain about selective burial. Why do some individuals show extraordinary robustness while others found in the same contexts do not? Were certain people of higher status given richly distinctive interment, and thus different preservation conditions, or are we seeing a case of differential preservation and sampling bias? The interpretive field remains active. Local narratives add further texture to Iron Hollow. A family who lived near the valley for generations tells of an old forge where strange fires once burned and where elders would pound metal on an anvil that emitted music-like notes. They recall a group of people known in local memory as the Smiths, whose craft was both feared and respected. These oral accounts are not detailed manufacturing manuals, but they provide social context. Metalworking can produce special social roles, smiths who combine technical knowledge with ritual authority. In imagining Iron Hollow, you can picture a ring of tents near a furnace glow at night, sparks flying like fireflies, a hammer falling with a rhythm that shapes both metal and communal identity. That kind of scene reminds us that technology is social as much as technical. We still don't know the full story of Iron Hollow's metallurgy, or whether the skeletal anomalies reflect unusual biology, or remarkable life histories shaped by labor and diet. What we do know is that artifacts there reshaped local economies and narratives, that technology and myth fed each other, and that careful, context-sensitive science continues to chip away at sensational claims even as it reveals deeper complexity. Perhaps the most dramatic mystery in the region is the Skyfall Crater, a shallow depression ringed by fractured bedrock and strewn with vitrified cobbles that glint like dull mirrors in the sun. Aerial surveys and geologic mapping show concentric fractures and shocked quartz and thin lenses, signatures often associated with impact events. At first glance, the crater's morphology and the presence of high-temperature glass suggest an airburst or low-angle impact sometime in the late Holocene. Excavations found charred layers with elevated levels of iridium and platinum group elements at certain horizons, and a thin, widespread ash layer with a radiocarbon date around 300 to 400 C in nearby coring sites. For some scientists, this combination points to a relatively localized astronomical event, perhaps a comet fragment that exploded above the surface, depositing vitrified silicate, producing shock metamorphism in local rocks, and leaving a measurable chemical signal. Interpretation is contested. Impact specialists caution that identifying a terrestrial impact requires multiple lines of congruent evidence: clear shatter cones, planar deformation features in quartz, robust geochemical anomalies, and a well-correlated stratigraphic horizon. While some features at Skyfall meet these criteria, others are equivocal. The glass varies chemically across short distances, suggesting heterogeneous melting processes, and some vitrified cobbles display textures more consistent with lightning-related fulgurites than with large-scale airbursts. Furthermore, regional paleoclimate records do not show a synchronous, globally significant cooling signal that might be expected if the event were of sufficiently large scale to affect wide swaths of the continent. Thus, a moderate, local airburst remains plausible, while larger catastrophe hypotheses must be treated skeptically. Competing theories extend into human response. If an airburst occurred, were the communities in the region affected in ways that the archaeological record can reveal? Some researchers point to a dispersion of charred settlements and a short-term hiatus in occupation layers in adjacent valleys dating to the same horizon, patterns consistent with demographic contraction or relocation. Others argue that human societies display remarkable resilience. Even catastrophic events often produce localized disruptions rather than wholesale collapse. Oral histories, casually and variably preserved, speak of a great sky fire. In some families' tales, stories that could be mythic memory of an impact or other dramatic event, or that could be independent narrative motifs that translate natural disasters into moral and cultural lessons. The Skyfall Crater pushes these conversations into a liminal zone where geology, archaeology, and oral memory intersect. Imagine standing on the rim at dawn, a wind lifting salt and sand in gray curtains, the glassy cobbles underfoot catching a pale light. Imagine the ancient sky, bright with a falling body or with a comet's tail. Imagine survivors gathering and turning a catastrophic night into a founding story, a narrative that explains new patterns of settlement or new ritual emphases. Whether an astronomical event happened or whether the crater is primarily a geological quirk remains contested. What is not contested is the crater's power to provoke stories, to shape memory, and to combine the cosmic and human into a single landscape. Across all these sites, Blackwater Ridge, the Glass Butte cairns, the sunken circle at Blue Mesa, the Salt Flats alignments, Iron Hollow, and the Skyfall Crater, a pattern emerges that is more thematic than typological. What binds them is not a single culture or a single explanation, but the way human beings have repeatedly transformed ambiguous phenomena into communal meaning. Sometimes the material evidence leans toward the pragmatic: irrigation, habitation, trade. Sometimes it points toward experimentation and craft: glassy materials, metallurgy, engineered architecture. Sometimes it opens toward the cosmic: alignments, impacts, and skyward myth. And sometimes, insistently, these dimensions coexist. As we draw this sequence together, it helps to step back and consider what these mysteries collectively teach us about how human knowledge is constructed and how it fails. First, evidence is rarely monolithic. A site that seems to announce one narrative at first glance, ritual usage, say, gradually accretes complexity when analyzed through multiple methods: isotopes, aDNA, micromorphology, remote sensing. Each method shades the story rather than erasing prior interpretations. Second, oral traditions matter. Sometimes they point to real, material remnants that science later confirms. Sometimes they are imaginative reworkings of the past. Often they are both. Listening to local memory is not the same as accepting every claim uncritically, but it is a critical part of robust inquiry. Third, anomalies are opportunities. A vitrified lens or an unusual alloy should not be prized simply because it is strange. It should be prized because it opens pathways to new hypotheses and cross-disciplinary collaboration. In other words, anomalies demand work, not headlines. There is an ethical dimension to consider as well. Many of the places we have traced are living landscapes for descendant communities, places of ceremony, memory, and identity. Archaeological curiosity must be balanced with respect for contemporary meanings and stewardship responsibilities. In practice, this means collaborative approaches, involving communities in research design, prioritizing non-invasive techniques where possible, and ensuring that knowledge production does not become a vehicle for exploitation. Preservation thus becomes both a technical and moral imperative. When a site yields an unusual artifact or a dramatic narrative, the choice about what to tell the public, what to withhold, and how to involve local voices is not neutral. Emotionally, these mysteries pull at something basic: our desire for continuity with the past. We want to reach backward and touch familiar hands, to be told that someone, somewhere, centuries ago, thought or felt like we do. The sites resist that desire in useful ways. They compel us to tolerate ambiguity, to recognize that continuity occurs in strange patches and that rupture is often the norm. They also remind us that wonder is not the enemy of science. Wonder is often the engine that moves investigators to ask better questions. The scientist who approaches the cairns with only skepticism misses the value of being provoked into new research. The person who infuses every soil lens with cosmic drama diminishes the role of careful contextual analysis. The wise stance combines humility with curiosity. So why do these mysteries matter beyond archaeological circles? They matter because they shape how we imagine human possibilities. They disclose the complexity of human adaptation in marginal environments, the ingenuity with which people exploited materials and celestial knowledge, the social forms that built meaning across generations, and the ways people respond to extraordinary geological events. They challenge modern narratives of linear progress and invite us to see ancient people as creative agents, not as failures awaiting our correction. They also caution us about easy stories. Don't take a sensational headline as the same thing as a peer-reviewed argument. Don't allow myth to drown the fine-grained data that slowly constructs a more reliable past. If there is a final, practical charge from these investigations, it is to keep the work collaborative and patient. The mysteries, whether glassy cairns, sunken richly charged rings, precise salt-flat geometries, metallurgy that surprises, or a crater that might record a skyfall, cannot be resolved by single techniques or by singular vocations. They require teams that meld geochemistry with oral history, aDNA with ethical consultation, archaeoastronomy with hydrology. They require long-term commitments to preservation and to local partnerships. They ask the public to move beyond appetite for spectacle toward an appreciation of incremental knowledge building that sometimes yields modest but durable answers. And still, for all the tools and collaborative sophistication we can marshal, these places keep one foot in the domain of the unresolved. That is not a failing, it is the texture of the human past. It is a space where you, the listener, are invited to imagine, to wonder, and to respect the limits of certainty. Picture again the ridge where spirals catch the light, the cairn where a bead glints like a star, the sunken circle where wet peat still holds a fold of a strip of metal, the lines across flats that might be calendars and canals, the hollow where hammers fell like a heartbeat, the crater where a skyfire may once have passed. Each site asks you to hold multiple narratives at once, a practical explanation, a ritual account, a geological story, and a mythic reading, and to prefer the evidence that best satisfies all constraints rather than the story that best satisfies desire. The most honest ending we can offer is not a neat solution but an invitation to read carefully, to listen to local voices, to collaborate across disciplines, and to accept that some answers will remain partial. There is poetry in that partiality. It reminds us that history is not a completed book but an ongoing conversation between the present and what remains. It teaches patience and humility. It underscores the simple human truth that people in the past, like people now, improvised, experimented, suffered, rejoiced, loved, and left traces not because they wanted to be found by us but because they lived in the full drama of their days. So with that, having walked the ridges, touched the cairns, sat in the sunken hollow, walked the measured lines, listened to the smith's rhythm, and stood on the crater rim, what remains is both a practical to-do list and an ethical posture. The to-do list, more targeted, minimally invasive research, careful interdisciplinary analysis of unusual materials, collaborative frameworks that center descendant communities, and preservation measures that respect both scientific inquiry and cultural meaning. The ethical posture, humility in interpretation, generosity in listening, and a refusal to convert every mystery into a spectacle. And finally, an open invitation, If you felt the tug of wonder while listening, if the image of a bead tinkling in a sunken ring stayed with you, carry that feeling into action. Support careful research, ask for methods and data when sensational claims are made, and when you visit ancient places, tread lightly. These landscapes are not museum displays, they are living archives. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding rigorous answers. Keep honoring the people who carry these markers across time. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.